Okay, welcome everybody. I'm going to get us moving because we've got quite a packed agenda this afternoon to get through. There's going to be a little bit of flexibility with timings as Storm Bert has intervened with some attendees today, although pleased to see so many people have battled the conditions to get here and battled our transport system. Welcome to our AGM, our Insights meeting, and lots of other interesting things going on today. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to, without further ado, introduce David James, who has been chairing our expert panel on education research funding with fellow members of the panel here, and they're going to talk through their work so far and give you a little tease of what may be coming next year, I think. So I shall hand over to you, David, and then take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and greetings, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces, and it feels actually I've just retired recently and cleared my office. I'm having this regular experience of of my life passing before my eyes, but mostly it's positive, and I'm getting used to it. So, really good to be here. We're here because we are most of a panel that's been commissioned by BERA called the BERA Expert Panel on Research Funding. What's interesting about that title is that as soon as we started really talking about what the work should encompass, we realized that it couldn't be just about funding at all. That you can't really talk about funding without talking about why we do education research and who it's for and who might benefit from it and who should have a say in what's done. So it is, of course, a very extensive task. We want to say a few things. I'm going to briefly introduce the work that we're doing, and then other members of the panel that are present will indicate some elements of the work that they consider particularly important or things that I've missed, basically. They'll chip in with. And then there's an opportunity for you to make comments or ask questions. And I feel that's really important. This is work for the association, and it should end up saying something that the association at least generally believes in and wants to say. So, please do have a think about what you want to say as we proceed. Okay, so there you can see the names of the panel. As a couple of panel members couldn't make it today, Hugh Morris and Daniel Muage, I think, isn't here, Otherwise, we're all here, including all the ex officio members. First of all, a little bit about context. I'll be ever so brief about these things because I only want to take up a few minutes. The context includes these elements, at least important elements: the rising quality of education research, as shown by the recent REF exercise. And it's quite a substantial indicator, that I would say. However, and I'll come back to this, falling total investment in education research. And that's happened over quite a period. Thirdly, ongoing concerns from many quarters, actually, about the relationship between research policy and practice. That's especially in teacher education in England, but not only in teacher education in England by any means. I was talking to some colleagues in USET about a year ago and realised that, people have done some really good work on this. So many people. And I happened to be talking about Viv Ellis's work, and realised that was 2010, that paper that I was referring to. And actually, those things are all still required. Nothing much has changed. And I think there are complex reasons for that, partly to do with governments, of course. Thirdly, concerns about the demand side. That is, the nature of education research that's commissioned. What's it like? Who's asking for it? What does it consist of? What are the assumptions made? Is it all useful? Who's it for? Does it promote creativity? And does it promote capacity building? We've been discussing some of these concerns. And then finally, we do have a different government. And there's a review of curriculum and assessment in Train, as you know. This seems like a good moment as any. Perhaps there was never a good moment, but as good a moment as any to be talking about what the association feels should be done differently or more or less. We do have some aims. I'm sure there's a lot of words on here, and you will have, the documents will have been available to you and are available after this session as well. You will have access to a progress review, which is a brief 4-page document, and also a longer working paper on funding. Amongst these aims, I want to stress a couple of things, as you'd expect. The first one is about mapping the nature and volume of funding for educational research, but also looking at how it's changing and trying to understand that better, especially in the context of other social sciences. But we want to look harder at the infrastructure. We want to look harder at the relationship between research policy and practice. Now, I could say again, I mean, BEER has long puzzled at these things. There's a fabulous report from 2013 here that I've been rereading, Why Education Research Matters. Prior to that, a whole load of really excellent papers by colleagues like Sarah Delamont, Mary James, John Gardner, Peter Mortimore, and others, Jeff Whitty, where folk have tried to sum up the arguments for a certain kind of education research. You can see under our aims there that we want to also talk about the generation of imaginative and creative responses to education challenges. We feel there's a need to do that afresh. And then make recommendations that are forward-looking. Our methods and our approach, very briefly, we are analysing, first of all, REF data that was generated as part of REF, and HESA data over time. We're interviewing key figures in the education research landscape. We've interviewed something around 22, and there won't be many more, but these really are key figures, people with long experience of the field, and they don't all come from, they're not all education researchers or all leaders of funders either. They're a mixture of roles. We're looking at key reports, especially some recent reports. There's been some very interesting work in recent years, some of it very troubling, I'd say. One from the Royal Society British Academy called Harnessing Education Research. That's one of the troubling ones. And perhaps a more immediately interesting source for us from the Academy of Social Sciences. But other data and publications from REF, from HEPI, from the work that the Lever-Hune Centre at Oxford did is extremely useful. That was on impact and other sources. We're looking at funding sources listed in the environment statements for REF, applicant submissions to that process, often usually listed prominent funders. And we're hoping for and wanting ongoing dialogue with the association. Well, I said I'd say something very briefly about the funding, and I will very briefly in less than a minute. There is real terms decline in total education research funding. This is very visible in the HESA returns. It's a decline in real terms of about 10% over the last 9 years. You can triangulate that to some extent with the data in REF, although it's a slightly different set of data and it's slightly different assumptions, but that shows an even bigger real terms decline of around 17% over 10 years or so. And then, very interestingly though, there's a marked change in the composition of education research funding, and if you've looked at the working paper you will have seen this, but I'll just give you a glance at how that looks. That's roughly the last 9 years. This is data from the Academy of Social Sciences report for only education research, and it shows that there's been a prominent decline in UK government research funding recorded in university returns. That's where this comes from. And one or two other sources have either stayed the same or declined. The ESRC, interestingly, represents a rise, quite a substantial rise over that period. And that's very interesting. It's partly driven, of course, by programs like the one that Gemma leads, but it's more than that. And we often hear, colleagues say, oh, ESRC, they give us more money, we're competing with psychologists, whatever they say about that. This puts a rather different take on those arguments. Finally, I want to mention a couple of potential emergent themes. I can only scratch the surface here, and colleagues will say a little bit more about the direction the work might go in. So the first potential theme is about the role that education research could or should have in supporting multi-sided responses to major social, economic and existential threats. Think about the floods and the storm and whether they indicate something longer term and how we know about that. Who knows about it? Who feels they have a say? Maybe there's an education connection there. So given its connections to provision, its constitutive multidisciplinarity, its inherent interdisciplinarity, its maturity in mixed methods, something else from the ref, and long-standing partnership working and co-production of knowledge, perhaps education research is an underused resource. So that's a potential direction of argument that we may develop. Another would be the need for more and more broadly consulted and connected strategic thinking and action to focus some of the education research effort on what matters most to people directly affected by it. One of our early indications from interviews is there's actually very little mechanism for strategic thinking about education research, much to my surprise, actually. So I'll now turn to my colleagues on the panel to invite them to add a couple of minutes of thoughts to what I've said, if they so wish, and then we'll move on to hearing some comments and perhaps questions from anyone else in the room. So Gemma, would you like to?
Standing up?
You can stand here if you, or that mic probably works if you want to sit down.
I've no idea. Can you hear me all right at the back? Okay, I'm just going to go for it. One of the reasons I am on this panel is because I am currently directing the ESRC Education Research Programme that was set up by the ESRC as much as anything else to try and demonstrate impact of research on policy relevant questions. And that has been a line of kind of investment that has been going for quite some while. As part of that programme, I'm also looking at what makes thinking that research will have simplistic impacts on practice works. In fact, if you review the literature, as some of my research team have, of the available models, the linear dissemination 2 model has least traction, actually, right the way across the social sciences, including in health. Far more to the point, a lot of the smart money at the moment is on systems thinking, that you take into account how research nests in a bigger ecosystem. And my project has been trying to look at that across the 4 nations of the UK. It's very easy when we see government funding to assume this is one government and it's over there in Westminster. Education has devolved. That creates different kinds of spaces for research to speak to policy and to practice. If you dive down into the explicit research strategies adopted by those 4 governments, they look quite different. If you look at what this leads to in terms of opportunities to genuinely co-partner on the ground, things become more tricky. I don't think any of the 4 nations has got the relationships between research, policy and practice right at the moment. I know these questions endure, and I'm looking at Leslie Saunders sitting in the body of this room with whom I set up the Education Policy and Educational Research SIG whenever it was, quite a long time ago now, because we knew those 2 worlds don't always speak well to each other. So I am very hopeful, as David flagged up, that at the end of this project we will have a clearer idea of the range of purposes for which research can be used. We'll have got out the tight box of linear dissemination to give a practitioner the answer to a question they didn't even know they asked, and instead of using research to open up what are the research agendas that really matter, because that for me is the value of research. It can point at what's wrong and it can suggest inquiries for the future. And if anybody wants to find out more, I will have leaflets. Come find me at tea.
Thank you, Gemma. I just realised I was very rude. I didn't introduce who was here properly. That was Gemma Moss, Professor Gemma Moss, as you know, who's leading the ESRC research programme on education research at the moment. Next colleague I'd like to invite is Professor Joanne Baird.
Thank
from
you.
Oxford.
Can you hear me? I think my microphone might actually be working, which is just as well because I'm not as loud as Gemma. I guess one of the things we anticipated when we went to speak to influencers in the field was that we'd hear the traditional critiques of educational research. So it's too small scale, it's not cumulative, there isn't enough quantitative expertise out there, it's too theoretical, and it's not policy or practice relevant. And I guess one of the good news stories is that there has been less of that. So it's been far more nuanced, and perhaps things have moved on actually in the field. So the funding structures are quite different now. EEF has been a massive splash in the pond, not just in the UK, but internationally, in terms of the kind of model that they've had and the amount of funding that they've had available. But we've also seen the field change in other ways. So there are lots of private actors conducting research, from edu-businesses or think tanks and so on. So some of those funds that we saw in that graph earlier aren't coming into universities, and especially I think some of the government funding for their various projects over the past 10 years ago. So there are questions for us, I think, that we'd really like to talk to you about that sort of face in all directions about the sorts of infrastructure there is for research funding, the capacity we've got, but also the kind of leadership issues that David was introducing. How do we ensure that we have public engagement with for the public good, with issues that matter to the public? Now, a lot of the way we are structured in higher education doesn't necessarily flow towards matters of the day that are occurring, that have risen dramatically over a short period of time. So I think there are issues for us about, and we're quite entrepreneurial actually as educational researchers. We're often very good at turning our research agendas to issues where there are funding, or where we can see that naturally there could be a connection with the kind of work that we do. I think one of the areas that we've had more research funding from research councils is in the impact funds, for example. But again, they tend to be really small and just leverage the kind of trajectories that we've already been on rather than changing them. So I guess one of the things I'd really like to hear from this esteemed crowd in the room today is, how do we go about addressing the public good issues for education in the UK currently, which is really significant? How do we leverage funding and capacity and have better infrastructures around that to make that sustainable over time?
Good. Thank you very much, Joanne. We've been blessed by having some help on the project from Bridget Azubuyuki, who is actually leaving us at the end of this month. Has been attached to the panel, not for very long actually, very modest amount of resource, but has done immense work on some of the data. And thank you for that, Bridget. Is there anything you want to add at the moment?
Nothing really. I'm just saying that it's been a great opportunity supporting the panel, looking at data for educational research, and my work has been just analyzing that data and leaving it to the experts to tell us what's really going on. So I'm looking forward to that final report so that we can learn more about it. Thank you.
Excellent. And we're hoping that your new job in Research England doesn't lead to any conflict of interest when you're cited as an author. We'll see. And Finally, I'd like to invite Anthony Tamai, who's a fabulous member of the panel, former CEO of Nuffield. And Anthony, would you like to add a few thoughts?
Is it on? Or it is on.
Yep.
Don't press anything. Okay. So thank you. So I'm not a researcher. I'm not an academic. So I'm the token layman on this group, and that's great because it means that when the difficult questions come along, I can defer along the panel here. So I don't want to say too much, but just a couple of reflections really from my career, I suppose. So Nuffield, where I was CEO for about 20 years, funds research with a very clear emphasis on having effects on policy and on practice. In a number of areas, social policy, particularly families, law, and of course education, which was the one I was most interested in. And reflecting on a lot of research we've funded over the years in the educational world, I would say that a lot of the most interesting developments, certainly from my point of view, didn't necessarily come out of education research. They might have come out of psychology, out of economics, even philosophy. But best of all, when it was both. So where you had economists, psychologists, and educators working together, you could often get much better results much more quickly. And I think that's still true, so that point about partnership. Since I left Nuffield a few years ago, I've done a variety of things. At the moment, I've just finished working on a Royal Society project on, it's called Mathematical Futures. It's looking at the future of mathematical education, taking a long view, a 10, 15-year view. And just a couple of reflections on that. The first point is that it is, as the name implies, it's forward-looking, it's futures-looking. It's not necessarily there to respond to crises and problems. And I did sense a bit of a stream there that education research was there to sort out difficult problems that were happening. And sure, it is that, but I don't think that's the only thing. I think looking ahead, that's a function that researchers can do much more readily than other people who are very much focused on delivery. So I do think that sense of looking ahead, looking to the future, and drawing on what we know from research is an important part of the equation. The Mathematical Futures Programme is very policy focused. The report, which I hope you'll all read, it's a rattling good read, is aimed specifically at policymakers, at mathematicians and mathematics educators, and at the general public. And that's a challenge in itself, by the way, trying to address different audiences within a single programme. But policymakers are the key audience, because what we want from this report is for it to make a difference, for it to make a change over the long term in the way mathematics and data education is thought of. Being from the Royal Society, it's very research based. Nullius in verba, the Royal Society won't allow things through unless they are evidence. And looking at it, so there's 250 references or something in the report. They're not by any means all from education. Most of them are. A lot of them are things you would expect. They're from the heartland of research into mathematics education, which is incidentally a very strong area in this country. But they're not, by no means exclusively from there. So I would say from the policy perspective, and this is bear in mind, this is an educational, purebred education theme. It's about how do we teach stuff. But it's, from the policy point of view, education research is only a part of the story. In this case, it's the most important part, but we need to think more broadly than that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, a couple of other things before we invite you to comment. I wanted to just underline that in selecting panel members, we were conscious of the need to incorporate experience from across the UK. So if you look at the panelists, they often sort of have direct experience of more than one country. of the UK, but we also wanted a little bit of a mixture of perspective as well amongst the panellists, and thought that was important as the variety amongst our interviewees, of course. And then finally, two final thoughts. One is that we have another way of summarising what we're really about here, which is, I'll read it out. The project will clarify the changing landscape of funding for education research to better understand the research environment and how best to support education research in the interest of the public good. You know, that's, if there is a sort of centre to all of those aims, it's that. And on a more sort of practical level, we're working quickly. We're aiming to prepare a report to present to BERA by early March. So things are moving. And at that, I think that's a good point at which to invite you to question, make statements, comments that we might find helpful. So, and that you might find helpful, of course, but most of all that we'd find helpful. Thank you very much. Anyone like to come in? Somebody at the back. Yes, hello.
Hello. Wondering how you're going to pull the figures apart to look at funding in relation to different kinds of universities. And I'm thinking here, particularly pre-post 92, if that distinction makes sense, smaller departments, and particularly those universities that don't deliver on ITE, because those seem to be differences in terms of what we might expect funding to look like and may require different kinds of policy direction.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting point. I think I'd say two things about it. The point that lies behind your question is very important. I do think that there's a space in our considerations, our deliberations, and probably in our report to comment on how that pans out. However, on the other hand, we do want our report to appeal to interests other than universities. And that means we have to take equal cognizance of things like, does the taxpayer think, does a politician who wants to represent the taxpayer think they're getting value for money? Or do practitioners feel they're served? And if not, why not? I mean, those are not primarily questions about which institution. They're questions about the relationship, broader relationship in that ecosystem that Gemma mentioned. But I think, you know, what you're saying is a whole series of important points there, because as we all know, there are inbuilt inequalities, some of them by virtue of very different histories, some of them by virtue of very different volumes of highly experienced researchers in certain places. And also a product of different relationships with policy and practice historically. So thank you for that. Does anyone want to add a thought to that one? Joanne?
I guess one of the things that we've talked about, which is not exactly a breakdown in that way, but it's relevant, is the difference between national and local agendas, the sort of regionalisation of educational issues. So I think that would probably speak to the kind of issue that you're raising, particularly as we've seen sort of ITE deserts now. And I know some of that's been, partnerships have been made to make sure that doesn't happen, but I think that's probably going down the track that you're interested in.
Gemma?
And just to add on that, we are aware that local can be an advantage, even for organisations that feel very peripheral to the REF discussion and the Russell Group discussion. There are local partnerships they can invest in that will do a deal of good locally. And I do take Anthony's point about looking more broadly beyond health. Just to give one example, Marmot Places, started by the Institute of Health Inequalities in UCL, does try and bring together people from education and from health and from charities that are interested in supporting children in really poor circumstances. It's looking at those new kinds of configurations that matters to me about this work, so that we're not looking in the space that Westminster government in particular puts us in. We're looking more broadly over and beyond that. I think that's important.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you for those. Yeah, hi, Leslie.
Your remit and the presentations have raised so many really important and difficult questions. One of those, I think, follows on from what Gemma has just alluded to, which is that many of the, it seems to me, you talked about the key educational challenges in your introduction, is that some of those challenges to the education system come from outside. And I'm thinking of poverty, inequality, absenteeism, all the problems that teachers and head teachers are dealing every day with. Also, the development of AI, where's that going to take education? And last, but certainly by no means least, the climate crisis. And all of those things are impacting on education, but they don't form part of the sort of conventional educational research agenda.
No, such an important point. One that's already creeping into the two documents we supplied ahead of today, actually, as well. But Gemma.
There's one thing I wanted to say back to Leslie about that, and that is in my conversation with policymakers, they are most aware of the questions which cannot be solved within a tight educational frame, including absence. You cannot get at absence by simply ticking off parents and telling them they should send their kids in. We do know from research that's been done by my colleague Lindsay McMillan at UCL that SEND is the biggest predictor of persistent absence, but the system as itself doesn't have that information. It can't call it up. So policymakers are increasingly aware that a lot of these more complex questions can't be solved by the MPD on its own. They need other information to make them turn into the real issue, which research can then tackle along with others. So I think that's such an important point, but there is an opportunity at that point to engage with intelligent policymakers and really think about reframing the agenda.
That's very good, very well put. I'd like to add something else as well. There's a tendency, I think, there's been a tendency, particularly among recent governments, to regard education research as primarily concerned with the things that that teachers might shift and change, like pedagogy. Although we all know that teachers never work on their own on these things, of course. But I suppose I'm pointing to an unfortunate tendency, which is a sort of a policy pretense that if you do the right kind of studies and come up with the right formula and tell teachers what to do, then they'll do it. That's a big assumption. Or that it can be recontextualized that easily. When it's a study done over there, does it look like it belongs here? Now one of the things I'm kind of hoping we might end up being able to say is that if you really are serious as a policymaker, say, let alone a citizen, if you're really serious about the absolute crisis in public health, and I'm thinking of the study that was published last week, or the week before, that showed that the problems caused by junk food, eating that's not very healthy, by the high pressure sales of, and all those things, of very unhealthy foods, high in sugar, high in fat, high in salt, that costs the UK more than the annual budget for the entire NHS. It's a lot of money, and that's a conservative estimate. This is well-respected research. Now, if you take something like that, or climate change, but take that, how do you start to tackle that? Well, you can't see it just as a health issue. You can't just, say, well, doctors should tell their patients to do the right thing, or let's send more leaflets out, or let's put more adverts on the TV. All those things might help, but actually it's an educational problem. Now, if we take it seriously as an education problem, that implies something about education research as well as provision. And I think that avenue is a powerful avenue for I mean, I don't know yet, but it seems to me to be a powerful potential theme in where we end up when we say things or try to say things about the future of education research. So thanks for your very good point and your question. Okay. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, just to add a point to that. I think that's a point well made. It's a very important direction to think about. But there's a long way to go. So a week or so back, the Treasury issued its, I can't remember what it's called, its areas of research interest. Is that what it's called?
ARIs,
Yeah, ARI. And this list, Treasury, as you know, drives everything. And this is a list of 60, 70 research themes, research areas that the Treasury is interested in, organised under 6 or 7, I'm not sure exactly, different larger themes. Naturally, they have a big economic theme all the way through. But what's a bit shocking, really, is that of those 60 or 70 projects, only 2 mention education. And they're both along those lines. What are the educational characteristics that predict this, that, or the other economic or social outcome? Only 2. I think that really shocked me, actually.
Yeah. Very good point. Thank you. Good. Sorry. Oh, hi. Thank you. Hi.
Yeah. Thanks, David. You mentioned the devolved nations have very different research strategies, and I know from working with the Scottish Government that there is a tendency often to develop a strategy which serves current policy agenda, shall we say, so they can be quite instrumental. And I think there is a space here for BERA to get involved in developing sort of more long-standing strategies and frameworks for research funding with the devolved nations particularly. I know you do a lot with the English government. So I just wondered to what extent BERA is engaged with the devolved nation governments around this issue.
First answer is I don't know. We might need to ask Nick in a minute, but a brief thought about that, which is that, my hope is that this report is another means to open up the comparison and open up the dialogue as well. There's already some dialogue in say, amongst Labour politicians about what's happening in Wales, which in some respects is quite different. Maybe this will help get more of that going on. If anything, there's an appetite in England at the moment for trying to rethink, I think. So, but I don't know, Nick, did you want to say anything?
Well, I was just going to say, I think the complication in the four-nation dimension is that each nation is somewhere else in its own policy cycle. So it means that it's hard to speak in one voice to the different places they're at. I think what we should be doing, and certainly the Education Research Programme is a resource for this, because we've been doing what we call policy landscape mapping. That's actually paying attention to the differences in research, policy, practice, relations, what's officially on the table. The English government does ARIs. It'll tell you what they're interested in commissioning. You will know that the Scottish government has a rather different long-term collaboration infrastructure, but it doesn't necessarily translate into collaboration in reality on the ground. Wales is doing something major with Curriculum for Wales, which has become, in my view, an incredibly complicated space. I think, for me, it's not about us saying this is the single recipe. It's about us saying what is the menu of ways in which research can make a contribution to the public good when working with others. Who are the others that we need to work with, at what scale, in what set of conditions? And if we can spell that out more clearly for our own members, then we've got a menu of ways of interacting which a member can draw on in their own context. And it also means learning from where you lot are. I mean, I think you are a very important resource from this point of view, because people in this room have experience that matters to the issues we're looking at.
Okay. Did you want to add anything, Nick?
Being honest, not as much as we would like to have contact in the governments of the four nations, but I think we are hoping that this report and this work will provide a catalyst for us to do that, because what we often find when we try and talk to government is they want to know what we want to say, and actually this will give us hopefully quite a lot to say, which will provide an inwards to that conversation. And I suppose the other point which we might touch on later in the AGM part of it is we have this year appointed on council 4 nations representatives on council, and part of their specific remit is to build those relationships within all 4 nations and do that. So we have sort of institutionally addressed the need to do that and planning on doing that more now, as well as using hopefully this report as a catalyst to do that.
Thank you. Yeah. While people are thinking, I mentioned earlier some slightly troubling work in the past from the Royal Society and British Academy working together. And you know, I make no secret of that perception, even though I've recently become a fellow of the British Academy. So I do tell people what I think about this. I think it's terribly important, and in a nutshell, this is how it goes. Harnessing education research was a very high-powered piece of work from organisations that are noticed and are listened to. It put together an account of the education research landscape that claimed to be ecological. That is, it claimed to be a sophisticated account of ecology of the education research landscape. Then there's a kind of slide towards the second half of the report to describing a solution which is purely a supply and demand solution. The subtlety of ecology is lost in that transition. Very disappointing. And I think one of the reasons, you know, that perhaps it's not taken up or continually taken up into the present. So we want to do something different to that. We want to have a more subtle appreciation of that ecology, which works through into suggestions, powerful suggestions for how to maintain it and benefit from it. What are the mutual dependencies? What are the relationships that if you change this, that changes? Who should be in a position to articulate a set of demands? You know, probably not just an office for research, but quite a wide group of interests, as long as they've got a real voice. So we have big ambitions. So that's an aside. Would anyone like to say anything else? Make a comment, ask a question? Okay. Yep. Hi. Yep.
Thank you, colleagues. Thanks, David. I just want to say something following on from Gemma's point, that I think thinking about who is doing the research is really, really important, and not so much the individuals, but the organization. So if we're thinking about the public good and what is the public, and what that public good looks like, then it should be this broad coalition of people and organizations doing the research. Now, I'm from the Institute for Education and Social Equity, which is a very small specialist organization. So we in universities should be working with research schools, teaching schools, small specialist organizations, private organizations, specialist organizations, so the broadest possible range of organizations. Recently, for example, we submitted a bid to Nuffield, waiting on the outcome of that. And we were the lead submitters on that bid, but we submitted it in partnership with 2 universities. We submitted one to the OFS. We were the lead submitters on that bid with 7 universities. So it's those kinds of partnerships we should be looking at, and not saying, well, this has to be driven by the universities, but it could be driven by all kinds of organizations looking at all kinds of interdisciplinary issues.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a fair point. We've been exploring in some of the interviews whether there's scope for calls and opportunities for funded research to be more explicit about partnership, to be more explicit about interdisciplinarity, actually, as well, rather than sort of leaving it just to researchers thinking, oh, this might be good to have this partnership. Some funding calls could be framed in that way, especially partnerships with practitioners, actually. And yet, very few are. There were elements of this, of course, even back in TLRP. You know, in 1999, there were strong encouragements to listen to advisors who were practitioners, and some projects, including the one I was part of, did it seriously and carefully. So it's not a new thing, but you know, there's scope maybe in that direction too. Okay, thank you for that point. Yeah, any others before we close? Yeah, Leslie then. Hi.
Sorry to come back again, but you talk about very justifiably being in the interests of the public good. And we've talked about public engagement. I wonder if you know how, what sort of proportion of funding is directed specifically towards public engagement, because it seems to me, you know, given that what other people have said this morning, that is going to be fundamental to the success of the project.
Thank you. Quick thought, and then I'll ask my colleagues as well. I think the public good and public engagement are very different things. So they're both great things, but they're not always the same thing. And I can think of examples of excellent research that had hardly any public engagement, and yet are immensely in the public good. For example, the research on that statistical research showing the effects of the year you start school. And so children, depending on when you happen to be born and the time you start school, the effects of that can be seen in one's early 20s, you know, for many people. So it's a very, very robust piece of work. I think Lorraine Dearden and others were involved. That is in the public good. That work is in the public good because it's about trying to get rid of a systematic inequality that the examination system solidifies and reifies. But there doesn't need to be much public engagement to do that work. However, I think they can be connected. So with that thought, I'll pass to any colleagues who want to chip in.
I will chip in, actually, because I think what we're on the cusp of is public engagement becoming the new disseminate to. So there is a lot of investment already going on in the university sector with the REF in mind, and the fact that the REF is moving away from pathways to impact to research engagement. UPenn, CAPE, those names might mean something to some of these people in this room. They're already promoting engagement, often engagement with policymakers, and it has the danger of being a run before we can walk, all right? So I think actually it behoves us as a research community to be zeitgeisty about that change in direction, the fact that people have realised Disseminate 2 has got its limits, but don't just get caught up in a bubble. We need to be exploring what public engagement means. And for instance, David's example, take those stats to who? That's the active engagement post having done the statistical analysis. So that the knowledge we generate within the academic domain has a chance to be tested out on a wide audience for whom it might be relevant, and a wide audience who have claims on education have reasons to dialogue with us and say, hey, you lot, haven't you thought about this? So it's that getting more two-way exchange built in to the structuring of the education field matters. We don't have the answers yet. It is worth saying in Canada, knowledge exchange has to be written into every funding opportunity. You have to say how you will do knowledge exchange as part of your research process, and it's just what people expect.
Great, yeah, thank you. Anything else from anyone? No? Okay.
I think that's a really interesting question. And just thinking about the maths project, in some sense, public engagement is the heart of the whole thing. You know, you have public who thinks that maths is something that lives in a silo and nobody else is interested, and thank God we don't have to do it. That's a big part of the issue, let alone Anyway, I just wanted to come back to the previous point, if I may, about partnerships, which I think is very well made, and certainly from a funder's point of view, it's always something that makes your eyes open a bit, and you think, yes, that's interesting. The question is, what do the different partners bring? Presumably they're bringing different things. I'd make 2 comments about that. The first is that they're not easy to put together, and it's quite easy to get people to sign up to a contract that says, yes, we'll do all this. But turning it into reality is not straightforward, and a lot just don't work. So I think it needs a lot of effort, it needs a lot of time. And that points to 2 things. One is leadership, because these things always happen, I think, because an individual or pair of individuals think this is really worth investing in. And having done that investment, it always seems a terrible shame when it stops at the end of the project.
Yes.
You know, you've created this kind of infrastructure, you've done the work, and then it stops. And that seems a terrible shame and a terrible waste. And I think, you know, reflecting on the educational world, research world over many years, I think it is very prone to this. It's prone to, you know, putting together groups that work very well and then stop. We don't have these much longer term bodies which provide leadership for everybody and provide a kind of way of thinking that influences other researchers and other thinkers. And they do exist, but if you compare them with the sciences, say, or medical world or whatever, I think we're less well provided with them. And I don't know why, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Good. Thank you. We've come so quickly to the end of our time for this item. I just wanted to say thank you for listening, and I hope that you're finding something of interest in this work that we're doing for the association. It's a very prosaic point. I want to mention none of us are being paid, but we're very happy about that. And I also want to ask you to come up to us in the rest of the event or subsequently. My email address is very easy to find. I'm still associated with Cardiff University. If you want to contribute a thought or a further question or anything else in relation to this work you want to say, please feel free to do so. But thank you for listening. Thank you.